Good afternoon and welcome to the Grain Stocks and Small Grain Summary Briefing. My name is Tony Dorn and I serve as the Acting Director of Statistics Division here at NASS. This briefing is for the Secretary of Agriculture and other policymakers at USDA to better understand the content and context of today's report. We're very pleased to have Seth Meyer, the USDA Chief Economist, as our Secretary Designate today. Welcome, it's good to have you here. There are a few important notes for our live stream audience that I would like to share. First, these reports are considered principal federal economic indicator reports, and the Office of Management and Budget provides specific guidance on how these important reports are to be released. OMB statistical policy instructs policymakers officials not to make public comment regarding the content of the reports within 1 hour of the release, so we will not be taking questions during this briefing from the public. However, NASS staff are available by email or phone, and NASS will host a social media event 1 hour after the release. We strive to have everything presented at this briefing match the official record. However, should there be any discrepancy between what's presented at this briefing and the published estimates, always refer to the official published estimates. With that, I'll turn it over to our esteemed branch chief, Mr. Lance Honing, chief of the NASS Crops branch. Lance, the podium is yours.
All right, thank you, Tony. I'll have to make sure Joe remembers that I'm now esteemed. I don't think he's ever mentioned that I can recall. So Tony's now my favorite intro act. All right, well, good afternoon. Good afternoon to everybody watching on the live stream as well. I got a lot of information for you as usual today, Seth. So you kind of know the drill. We'll run through things pretty quickly, but we'll give you an opportunity to quiz me afterwards if there's anything you want to talk more about. So I'll jump right in. We'll move through it fairly quickly. Anytime you see a gray box on the front of the report, I try to highlight that same information here. Nothing really new. This is part of our regular process, but a lot of times folks kind of need a reminder that in September, in fact, in the grain stocks report, we actually publish acreage yield and production revisions for the previous season for corn and soybeans. Obviously, this is the end of the marketing year. We've got ending stocks now. And so it's the perfect time, obviously, to go back, look at a balance sheet for the entire year. As you can see in the box here, those revisions were extremely minor for corn. You can see we revised production down just 15 million bushels, soybeans down 5.93 million bushels. So just minor tweaks. I'll talk a little bit more about those a little bit later in the presentation and tell you exactly where those came from. As I normally do, I'll kind of start things off by talking about some of the survey work and other information that we utilized in preparing the estimates published in the reports today. First of all, from a survey perspective, a couple of producer surveys I'll start with. Our September Ag Survey. Of course, this is the large survey that we do of producers. You can see just about 56,000 producers were sampled from August 30th through September 14th. Basically, we're asking them to report their acreage yield and production for the small grain crops. In most cases, that's actual harvest results. We've got a slide later that'll show you kind of how harvest progress compared this year to the previous years. And then in addition to that, we asked them to report their quantities of grains and oilseeds stored on the farm. That's where we get the on-farm portion for our grain stocks report. And then the second survey you see listed there, that's how we get the off-farm portion with our off-farm grain stock survey. There's about 8,100 facilities, commercial facilities across the country. We reach out to nearly all of those, same time period, same sort of information. Additionally, we do have our objective yield for winter wheat. Of course, this time of year, it's not really a specific time window we hit because we're capturing all of those samples before harvest. And so you can see total about 1,155 of those samples we had this season feeding in. And then from an administrative data standpoint, both FSA certified acres and then the failed acres from FSA and RMA, some critical components, particularly when we're looking at those final small grain numbers. The first map I have here just highlights those sample sizes by state for the September Ag Survey. Of course, the deeper the color, the larger the sample. And as you would expect with our focus on both grain stocks and the small grain crops this time of year, you can see where those larger samples fall. So we will start things off by looking at winter wheat. So final planted area for winter wheat, 36.7 million acres. It's down just 0.3% or 111,000 acres. From what we published back in August. Of course, you'll remember for the first time this August, we actually reviewed those planted acres based on the FSA data. So obviously that's why you see a bit of a smaller adjustment made now. We made some of that adjustment then. Overall, it is 10.3% above what was planted last season. Harvested area though, final numbers there, 24.7 million. You can see that's down 3.2%. So obviously a little bit more abandonment than what we had previously forecast. It is still up 5.2% year over year. I'll talk a little bit more about that abandonment on the next slide. But before I do that, you can see our final yield, 50.6 bushels per acre. That's up 5.2% or 2.5 bushels from that final yield forecast back in August. 7.7% above last season or 3.6 bushels better than last year's crop. So that puts our final production at 1.25 billion bushels, 1.7% above August and 13.1% above last year. Next, we'll take a look at the planted and harvested acres over the last several years. And here you can see, of course, that difference between the two lines does represent that abandonment. If we look at that harvested to planted ratio nationally, 67.3%, that is the second lowest ever. And the only other time was back in 1917. So obviously we've talked about this all season long, right, with the dry conditions. In fact, a huge part of that was in Kansas, 71% there. That's their ninth lowest and lowest since 1951. Texas, I believe, was the second lowest in quite a few years as well. So definitely higher abandonment than normal. As a result of that, as is oftentimes the case, we see pretty decent yields. In fact, in this case, you can see sitting right on trend at the end of the day. And again, with some of the tough conditions out there, abandoning those worse acres does leave you with a pretty good yield. And that's what we saw this season. The next couple of maps highlighting the winter wheat yields by state. This first map shows you the percent change from the August forecast. So this is literally showing you all the top number is the final yield. The lower number is that percent change from August. All the states colored in any shade of blue are increasing from August. Any shade of red are decreasing. Deeper the tone, larger the change. And anytime you see a pound sign, it indicates a record high. And we had a bunch of record high yields this year for winter wheat. Delaware, Illinois, Indiana, Kentucky, Maryland, Missouri, Montana, New Jersey, New York, North Carolina, Ohio, Tennessee, Texas, and Virginia. So very good year for a lot of places. Just to quickly point out something you haven't seen on one of these maps before, you'll see a few states that are colored in white and don't have a change. Those are states that we don't publish estimates for during the growing season, so nothing to compare back to, but did want to go ahead and drop their final yields on the map for you to see there. This next map, again, just showing you those final yields by state, but here you can see the percent change from last year. And of course, here you'll see increases across most of the growing area. Notable declines would be Kansas down 5.4%. The Dakotas down a bit, and then up in the Northwest, obviously a bit lower than what they experienced last season as well. This next graphic just highlights some information from the objective yield. Nothing really changing too much here from what you saw back in August, but the vertical bars there represent the number of heads per square foot measured by the survey. 40.8. You can see pretty comparable to where we were last year, but that red dot quite a bit higher in the bar. That is the 10-state yield. In fact, you can see that increase that I told you about earlier from the August forecast, driven pretty heavily by these 10 states. So you can see that dot move up. So actual harvest obviously revealing even better yields than what folks had expected. Just very quickly here, just a quick look at the winter wheat production and how it compares over the recent seasons. Really nothing too standing out too much here on this graphic, I would say. So let's jump ahead and take a look at how the winter wheat production final total compares with the pre-report published expectations. Quick reminder for folks, the way this graphic is laid out, each of those blue dots represents an individual industry member's published expectation. The red block represents the NASS estimate. So you can see right up at the top end of those expectations, again, the increase in yield a little bit larger than folks had anticipated. Next, we'll move on to the other spring wheat. Here you can see planted area final at 11.2 million acres. That's down 1% or just 115,000 acres from what we published back in August, but it is still up 3.2% year over year. Harvested area, here kind of the opposite effect. You can see actually bringing the harvested area up, increasing that harvested to planted ratio. Farmers back in June, when we last asked about harvested area, a lot more pessimistic than what reality turned out to be. Of course, conditions back in that time frame weren't that great, and so not surprising that they were a bit pessimistic. Excuse me, but overall, you can see we're up 5.1% year over year. Final yield, big jump here to 46 bushels per acre. That's a 10% or 4.2 bushel per acre increase from August. So in the end, just barely below last year's final yield. And so again, harvest results much better than what folks had anticipated during the growing season. So overall, 504.9 million bushels produced. See 12.3% above August and 4.6% more than was produced last year. Again, talking about the acres. First off, just a reminder, this was the first increase in planted area since 2018. But as you can see with that increase in harvested area, pretty much back in line with what we would see in a typical good year in terms of abandonment. So nothing too alarming there as well. Even though we saw the big increase in yield from our August forecast, you can see we're still below trend and pretty much in line with what we saw last season. So certainly not a bad yield, but even with the big increase, it's certainly not an outstanding yield either. Next, we'll take a look at the other spring wheat yields by state, and first how they compare to that August forecast. As you would expect, based on the large increase I just showed you, a lot of blue on this map. Pretty sharp increases in both the Dakotas, Minnesota, and Montana. And that's what's driving that yield up. Obviously, a different story in the Northwest. You can see Washington down quite a bit from what they had expected. And similarly, if we look as we did for winter wheat at those spring wheat yields by state and how they compare to last year, a little bit different story here, kind of a mixed bag, I guess you could say. North Dakota, obviously our largest producing state, fairly modest decline year over year, but offset by those increases in particular in Montana and Minnesota. Quick look at the production, how it compares over time. The 505 million bushels, just up a little bit from last year, but still down from most of those earlier years. This might be well, I shouldn't say might. This is the biggest surprise you're going to see in the report today. Obviously, as you can see on this graphic, folks were not expecting the production to be up quite this much. Obviously, as I mentioned earlier, we did increase harvested area. We did increase yield, which led to a pretty sharp increase. So clearly outside the range of expectations today. Moving on to durum wheat, again, slight adjustment made to the planted area. In fact, down just 7,000 acres from what we published back in August. Very little change to the harvested area here as well. So not much happening acreage wise compared to August. Yield though at 37 bushels per acre. That's up 1.5 bushels from August, but still off sharply from last year's yield. 59.3 million bushels produced. You can see it's up from August due to the yield increase, but still well below last year, again, due to the yield decrease from last season. Looking at the acres, this is a pretty broad chart. I would say you can see we're pretty much in the same line that we've been for the last several seasons, so nothing too noteworthy there. Yields all over the place on durum. It's up, it's down, and you can see this year actually quite a bit below trend, in fact, but conditions not ideal. Obviously in North Dakota this year, and that's where the majority of the durum's at, quite a bit in Montana as well. But you'll see that on the next couple of slides. Obviously better than what we expected in August. You can see increases in Montana and North Dakota. We do see a pound site in California, so it was a record crop there, but Montana and North Dakota, the vast majority of the durum produced there. And if we look at it year over year, it's North Dakota that's pulling that yield down year over year with a 7.5% decrease in yield there this season. Production wise, again, 59.3 million bushels. We talked about down from last year, not terribly out of line with what we've seen in the last several seasons. Comparing with industry expectations, I'd say no major surprise here either, pretty much right in the middle of those expectations. The other three small grain crops included in the small grains report today, barley, you can see some kind of a similar story here, right? We brought the planted area down about 2.8% from August, but the harvested area up. So less abandonment obviously there than previously anticipated. Both those acreage numbers are up year over year. Yield at 72.4 bushels per acre. That's down 3.6% from August, but still better than last year. So we finished at 185 million bushels. Oats, very little change to the planted area, down 1% year over year. Harvested area again up a bit, so a little less abandonment on the oats as well than we had previously expected. Yield at 68.6 bushels per acre, 11.5% better than what we had previously forecast. So up 5.9% year over year, putting production there at 57 million bushels. And of course, rye, the crop that's mostly cover crop. So you can see of the 2.3 million acres planted, we only harvest 322,000. No major stories there. Yields down year over year, harvested area down year over year. So as you would expect, production obviously down fairly sharply. Just a quick look at the percent of the acres that were still left to be harvested when we did our survey. This is not crop progress information. This is literally the folks that we surveyed for this particular report. We asked them how many of those acres that you're reporting were still left to be harvested. And so we put a little bit of perspective on it here. You can see with the exception of durum wheat, really not that much left to be harvested. Fairly sharp or fairly high percentage on durum, but as you can see looking back, that's not uncommon this time of year. And with conditions what they've been, I don't think there's any reason to expect that things would have turned out differently for those folks that were left either. All right, we'll close the books on the acreage yield and production for the small grains. We'll shift gears over to the grain stocks report. We'll start with all wheat stocks. Of course, September is our beginning stocks for all wheat. You can see total stocks there, 1.78 billion bushels, virtually unchanged from where we were a year earlier. The on-farm stocks actually up 1.2% year over year, but the off-farm down just 0.4%. So again, pretty much washing out on a year over year basis. The next graphic, quick reminder, the way this is laid out, each of the vertical bars represents the beginning supply for each crop season. You see the 4 lines representing the 4 quarterly stocks estimates that we make throughout the season. And as I said, beginning stocks for all wheat. So you can see the green line representing that 1.78 billion bushel total. June to August disappearance, 614 million bushels. That's up 7.7% from the same time a year earlier. No surprise here. You can see the red dot right in the middle of the blue dots there. So should be pretty much what folks were expecting. Corn stocks, that's the flip side here. It's the ending stocks, right? So you can see ending stocks for corn, 1.36 billion bushels. That's down 1.1% from a year earlier. On-farm stocks up 18.8% year over year, but the off-farm down 12.9% year over year. If we look at that on the graph to see how things have checked out all season long. Again, here the green lines at the bottom because we're ending stocks. That June to August disappearance, 2.75 billion bushels. That is down 7.6% from the same period a year earlier. Not a huge surprise here, but maybe a little bit on the lower side of what folks, or at least what most folks were expecting, but nonetheless in the range. And so we'll give you just a quick look at the balance sheet here. So just to be clear on what we've got laid out in here, that first column where you see the previous estimates, those numbers with asterisks next to them, we literally took those numbers out of the September WASDE report. So you can see the imports, exports, food, seed, and industrial, that's all published WASDE numbers. And then of course, the other numbers in that column would be the previously published NASS estimates. Second column over, September 30th, all of those numbers with the asterisks we're just carrying forward for the purposes of this balance sheet. Some of those numbers will likely change in the next WASDE report. We understand that, but they're not published yet. So we carry them into this second column. And so on the right, then you can see the changes. Again, 15 million bushels was the only change that we made to the previous year's production. The ending stocks, you can see about 91 million bushels below what was previously published in the WASDE as a forecast of ending stocks. So overall, if nothing else were to change in the balance sheet, that feed and residual total would be up about 76 million bushels from what was published earlier this month. But who's to say what that'll be by the time we get all those numbers that Mike's able to incorporate into next month. That 15 million bushel adjustment on production, obviously that's pretty minor, mostly acreage driven. We did bring planted acres up just 10,000 acres, but the driver there, harvested area down 92,000 acres, mainly due to the administrative data with some of the failed acre information we picked up. Yield up 1/10 of a bushel. That's mostly a mathematical calculation after adjusting the acres. Next, we'll move on to soybeans. So ending stocks for soybeans, 268 million bushels. That's down 2.3% year over year. On-farm stocks up 14.4%. Off-farm total is down 7.2%. Moving ahead to the chart here. Here you can kind of see graphically how that all plays out. Was the 5th largest beginning supply for soybeans, just a reminder there. June to August disappearance for soybeans, 528 million bushels. That was down 23.8% from the same time period a year earlier. A little bit of a surprise here. If we look at how it compares with the industry up toward the top end. So a few more bushels than folks were, at least most folks were expecting. So I'll catch up to you now and look at the balance sheet. See you sneaking ahead on me there. I guess we'll allow that. This is laid out exactly the same way, so I'm not going to explain the asterisks and everything in this table. But again, here you can see the small adjustment on the production. Again, it was acreage driven. No change to planted area, but harvested down just 167,000 acres on soybeans. Yield here was up 1/10 compared to what we had previously published for 2022. But again, that's a mathematical calculation with the adjustment to the acres. And then, of course, again, if you look at the second column, you'll see a -1 down at the bottom with the residual, but we are anticipating some changes in some of the crushings, imports, exports, the other components of the balance sheet. Remember that column, we're just carrying forward what was previously published in the WASDE, but there's been new data since then. And so we're anticipating that that will not be a negative number at the bottom of that column when the next WASDE report comes out, but that's what we've got to work with today. All right, before we wrap up, just a few other crops included in the grain stocks report that I'll talk about. Barley stocks as of September 1, up 8.6% year over year, increases in both the on and off farm totals there. Durum wheat up 6.5% from the same time a year earlier. Again, increases on both on and off farm stocks there. Oats, the total is up 20.3% year over year. The on-farm down 14.9%, but huge increase in the off-farm side on the oats. Sorghum stocks, big decline there. Of course, that's production driven. Less production, less stocks. And then sunflower stocks, you can see the total up 24.7%. That's driven by a huge increase in the on-farm stocks. The off-farm actually down 9.8% year over year. Last couple of slides before I wrap up here, you can just see a sneak peek at some of the upcoming reports over the next month or so. Obviously on Monday, hopefully, you can see our monthly care reports. October 12th, next crop production and cotton ginnings, the 20th cattle on feed, cotton ginnings, rice stocks later in the month, and then ag prices at the end of October. A couple of quick reminders for especially our folks watching online. On October 17th and 18th, we will have our fall data users meeting. It will be virtual. It'll span the 2 afternoons from noon to 3 Eastern time, both days. We'll have both large group sessions and breakout sessions as well. So folks can go out there and register. So we hope to see everybody online for that. And then, as Tony mentioned at the beginning of the briefing here, shortly after this is finished, I will be on X taking any questions that folks have, hosting our regular Stat Chat series. Hopefully it is as lively and entertaining as it was earlier this month So we'll see. We'll see. And that is the last slide that I have. So let me thank everybody online for tuning in and watching this afternoon. We're going to actually end the live stream now. So we look forward to seeing folks next time.